The planet was a cruel place. The two suns in the sky blazed like angry fires, their heat scorching everything in sight. The ground was cracked and dry, with barely any life left. It was a desert world, a planet that seemed to have forgotten how to be kind. This was the last place Zora, a Mirian woman, had ever expected to find herself stranded. Zora's silver skin shimmered under the burning light, but it didn't protect her from the heat. Mirians were a strong species, built for tough environments, but even they weren't made to survive in a place like this. Her journey had been long, and she had hoped to reach a friendly planet before running out of supplies, but her ship had been badly damaged during a crash landing. Her fuel had run out, and her water supply was almost gone. With each step, the burning sands seemed to swallow her energy. She was on her last legs. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and her lips were cracked and dry. Zora had been walking for what felt like days, with no sign of life in sight. The world around her was silent, too silent. She had been here long enough to know the desert could be a deadly place, where every hour could be the difference between life and death. Her mind started to play tricks on her. The heat and lack of water made her see things, mirages, shimmering objects in the distance that disappeared when she tried to focus. She had seen one too many false hopes of an oasis, only to be left more drained than before. As she stumbled forward, she barely had the strength to keep her eyes open. She wasn't sure how much longer she could go on. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take another step, she saw him. At first, she wasn't sure if he was real. She blinked hard, trying to clear the fog in her vision. There in the distance was a figure, a human. His silhouette stood against the sun like a dark shadow. He wasn't moving much, but there was something about him that caught her attention. Was he a hallucination, like the other strange shapes her dehydrated mind had conjured? Or was he real? Zora tried to call out, but her voice barely came out as a rasp. She staggered toward him, her body moving on pure instinct more than anything else. As she got closer, she could see more clearly. He was a man, with dark hair and a simple outfit, just like the humans she'd heard about during her travels. But what was he doing here, in the middle of nowhere? Fear crept into Zora's mind. Humans weren't known for their kindness. Many of them had a reputation for being ruthless, especially to creatures like her. They often took advantage of weaker species, and she had heard stories about humans enslaving or killing other races for sport. This man, this human, could be one of them. Zora's heart pounded in her chest. She was too weak to defend herself, but she would never let him capture her without a fight. She had to be strong, even if it meant her end. She pulled herself up to stand tall, though her legs were shaking, and she backed away from him, preparing herself to flee. She had to get away, or he might take her as a prisoner. She didn't know what he wanted, but she couldn't trust him. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "I don't trust you." The human seemed to freeze for a moment, his dark eyes narrowing as he looked at her. He didn't seem angry or hostile. Instead, there was confusion in his gaze, and then something else. Concern. "Hey, I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently, his voice soft but firm. "I just want to help." Zora took another step back, her breath quickening. She didn't believe him. She couldn't. There was no way a human would be kind to her, not after everything she'd seen in her life. It didn't make sense. The man took a cautious step forward, then stopped. "I'm not here to fight. I'm just trying to survive like you." Zora blinked. Survive? What did he mean? Everyone here was struggling. The world didn't care if you lived or died. It just kept going, indifferent to any living being's pain. "Lies," she croaked. "You're lying. You'll kill me. That's what humans do." She could hear the tremor in her voice, and she hated it. But she couldn't stop herself. The fear was overpowering. She was already so weak, so close to breaking. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not even for a moment. The man didn't flinch. He just looked at her, his expression steady and calm. "Look," he said, his hand reaching into a pouch on his side. "I have water. You're dehydrated, aren't you? You need it." Zora's eyes flicked to the small canteen he held in his hand. The sight of water made her throat burn with need. It had been so long since she had a drop. But even then, she wasn't sure if she should trust him. "You want me to drink from that?" she whispered, eyes still locked on the canteen. "Why?" He sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. "Because you're about to die of thirst if you don't. I don't want that to happen to you." Zora stared at him for a long moment. He was being so calm, so unlike the humans she had heard about. The kindness in his eyes, though strange, made her feel something she hadn't felt in so long: hope. She had always believed that humans were monsters, but here he was, offering help instead of harm. Her hands trembled as she reached out, and she took the canteen from him. The cool water was a miracle. She tilted it to her lips, her body almost desperate to drink, but she forced herself to sip slowly. Each drop was like a blessing, and soon her strength began to return. The cool water from the human's canteen was like a miracle. Zora could feel it working its way down her dry throat, soothing the parched pain that had been tormenting her for so long. For a moment, the world around her seemed to stop, and she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this human wasn't the danger she had thought. Her hand shook as she lowered the canteen, and she took a step back, blinking in confusion. The water had given her a rush of energy, but it also gave her new thoughts. Thoughts she didn't want. How could he be offering her this gift so easily? Was this just a trap? Maybe he was pretending to be kind, waiting for the right moment to attack. Zora's sharp instincts told her to be cautious, to stay alert, but the human didn't seem to pose an immediate threat. His face, though tired, held no anger, no malice. She could see it clearly now, his expression soft, as though he genuinely cared about her well-being. That was strange, very strange. Still, she couldn't ignore the gnawing fear deep inside her. "I didn't expect to find anyone out here." The human spoke quietly, his voice warm, almost as if he was trying to comfort her. "I've been here for weeks, but I'm glad I found you." Zora's eyes narrowed, and her breath hitched. "Found me? What do you mean, found me?" she asked, her voice shaky from both the heat and the sudden realization. "You were watching me." He quickly shook his head. No, that's not what I meant. I just mean, I didn't think I'd come across another living being out here. It's a big desert, and most people crash like I did." Zora stiffened. "You crashed?" Her eyes darted to his clothes, which were worn and dusty. "You're stranded too." The human nodded. "Yeah, my ship got caught in a storm. The engines went down, and I ended up here. It's been tough, but I've managed to survive so far. And when I saw you, I had to help." Zora studied him, feeling a strange mix of skepticism and something else, something close to curiosity. Was he really stranded, or was he pretending, setting some kind of trap? She took another cautious step back, still holding the canteen tightly in her hands, as if it could somehow protect her from whatever the human's intentions were. "You expect me to believe you?" she asked, her voice rising slightly with suspicion. "A human, stranded in this desert, offering me water. Why? What's in it for you?" The human looked confused, his eyebrows furrowing as he glanced at her. "What do you mean, what's in it for me? I'm just trying to survive. Like you." Zora's mind raced. Could it be true? Was he just a man lost, like her? She had heard the stories, seen the way humans treated other species, how they were often merciless. It didn't seem possible that one of them could care for her, let alone want to help. She looked down at the canteen in her hand, the water still cool against her fingers. A wave of doubt washed over her. What if this was part of a bigger plan? What if he was testing her, waiting for her to lower her guard so he could overpower her? The truth was, Zora didn't know what to think anymore. She was exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. And she couldn't trust herself. The last few days of isolation had done strange things to her mind. She had lost track of how long she had been walking under the harsh suns, and now, standing in front of this human, her mind was clouded by fear. Her mouth opened to say something, but the words came out wrong. "You're lying. I know it. You want something from me." The human recoiled slightly, his eyes widening in surprise. "I don't want anything from you," he said, his voice a mix of confusion and hurt. "I don't even know who you are. I just want to help. I can't let you die out here." Zora could see the sincerity in his eyes, but that didn't mean he was trustworthy. Her people, her kind, had learned not to trust others easily. They had seen too much cruelty in the galaxy. Too many species took advantage of others for their own gain, whether it was for food, power, or control. Zora had been part of that cycle in her past, and she had seen it firsthand. "I don't believe you," Zora muttered under her breath. "You're just like the others. You want to hurt me. Take me somewhere. Lock me up. Use me for whatever you need." Jason's face softened. His mouth opened as though he was about to say something, but Zora cut him off, her voice sharp. "Don't say it. I don't want your help. I'll survive on my own." Her heart pounded in her chest, and she wanted to scream at him to go away, to leave her alone. The desert had taken so much from her already. The last thing she wanted was to rely on someone else. She had been independent for so long, even if it meant surviving alone. But in the deepest part of her, something else ached. She had no choice but to face the truth. She was dying out here, alone. Jason didn't speak right away. Instead, he just watched her, his expression still gentle. "All right," he said after a long pause. "I won't force you to take my help, but I can't just leave you here. If you need me, I'll be around. I'll keep my distance if that's what you want. But I'm not going anywhere, not while you're still out here, dying." Zora didn't respond at first. His words hung in the air between them, the weight of them making her uncomfortable. She couldn't believe she was hearing this. A human, offering help, not out of selfishness, but because he genuinely cared about her survival. But even then, something inside her told her it was too dangerous to trust him. She needed to be cautious. There was always a price for kindness in the galaxy. "Why should I trust you?" Zora finally asked, her voice quieter now. "What's to stop you from turning on me once I'm weak?" Jason looked at her, his face sincere. "Nothing," he said softly. "You don't have to trust me, but I won't hurt you. I just want to survive. And I'm guessing you do too." Zora was silent for a long time, still clutching the canteen, her mind racing. For a moment, she wondered if she could truly survive alone. But could she trust this human? The doubts continued to swirl in her head, but she knew one thing for certain. She didn't want to die here, alone, in the burning desert. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice firm, though her body sagged in exhaustion. "But don't think this means I trust you." Jason simply nodded. "That's fair, but I'll be here when you're ready to talk." As the hours passed, Zora sat alone under the twin suns, her mind still unsure. But somewhere deep inside, a tiny spark of hope flickered. A hope that maybe, just maybe, there were still some people out there who could show kindness, even in the harshest of places. Zora sat on the dry, cracked earth, staring into the distance. The twin suns beat down on the desert landscape, turning the world around her into a shimmering blur of heat. Her mind was still filled with confusion. The human, Jason, had given her water, and for a brief moment she thought she might have misjudged him. But she couldn't let her guard down. Not yet. She needed to think. Alone in the middle of this desert, she had only herself to rely on. That's how it had always been. Trusting others had only ever led to pain, betrayal, or worse. The universe was harsh, and her species, her people, had been shaped by the harshness of it. They survived by being strong, by being cautious, and by never showing weakness. And here, in this lonely place, Zora was struggling with a weakness she couldn't control. Her body had been through so much, and the lack of food and water was taking its toll. She was dizzy, disoriented, and her thoughts felt fuzzy, like they were slipping away from her. Every step she took seemed harder than the last, and she could feel the sun's heat pushing her closer to the brink of collapse. She knew she couldn't keep going like this. The voice of reason in her mind told her to keep moving, to keep searching for shelter or safety. But the more she tried to ignore the exhaustion, the more it overwhelmed her. Zora closed her eyes, letting the wind blow across her face, trying to find some small comfort in the barren wasteland. But then she heard it. The sound was faint at first, like a soft buzzing in the air, but it quickly grew louder. Zora opened her eyes and looked around, her heart racing. She could hear something in the distance. It wasn't the usual silence of the desert. It was a machine, something mechanical. Her pulse quickened. Could it be another ship? Had someone else arrived? Or was it just another trick of the heat, her mind playing games with her? But as the sound grew louder, there was no denying it. It was real. Zora struggled to stand up, her legs wobbling beneath her, but she couldn't ignore the growing sound of the machine. She turned her head toward the horizon, scanning the endless expanse of the desert. And then, like a speck in the distance, she saw it, a small vehicle, dust flying behind it as it raced toward her. Her first thought was that it might be another human, another person who would try to take advantage of her. Her instincts flared, and she immediately felt the need to retreat, to hide from whatever danger was coming. But her body wouldn't cooperate. She was too weak, too tired, and the effort to move seemed too great. Then, as the vehicle came closer, Zora saw something that stopped her in her tracks. It was Jason. He was driving a small, battered speeder, his face set in concentration as he steered it toward her. The moment Zora recognized him, a wave of confusion washed over her. Why was he coming back for her? She had refused his help. She had made it clear that she didn't trust him. Was he here to trap her after all? To finish what he had started? Zora took a step back, but her legs nearly gave out under her. She could barely stand, and the pain in her body was unbearable. She had reached her limit, and there was no way she could keep running from him. Jason pulled the speeder to a halt in front of her, the engine sputtering a bit before it went quiet. He hopped out quickly, looking concerned as he approached her, his eyes scanning her body for signs of distress. "You look like you're about to collapse," Jason said, his voice full of worry. "I told you not to try and push yourself too hard." Zora opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was too dry, and she couldn't find the words. She was barely holding it together, and she knew it. The heat of the desert, the lack of water, and her growing fear had taken its toll. You came back for me," she managed to croak, her voice weak and unsure. "After everything I said." Jason nodded, kneeling in front of her. "Of course. I didn't lead you out here to die. I told you I was here to help." Zora couldn't believe it. She had expected him to turn on her, to abandon her, or worse. But here he was, still trying to help despite her mistrust, despite everything she had said to push him away. For a moment, she felt a deep, painful emotion welling up inside her, something that was foreign and uncomfortable. She had never let anyone in, never allowed herself to trust anyone. And now, here she was, a stranger, about to be rescued by the very person she had feared. I don't understand," Zora whispered. "Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me?" Jason paused for a moment, looking at her with something she couldn't quite place. Something kind, something genuine. "Because we're both stuck out here, and I can't let you suffer," he said simply. "You've got nothing left, and neither do I. But I'm not going to leave you to die alone in this desert." Zora's eyes filled with confusion and something else, something like hope. She was so used to being alone, to surviving on her own, that she didn't know how to react to this. Jason reached into the speeder and pulled out a small pack, handing it to her. "I got some supplies. I've been gathering them for myself, but I can share." Zora hesitated, her hands trembling as she took the pack from him. Inside, she found a small can of food and more water, more than she had seen in days. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. And the gesture, this simple act of kindness, meant more to her than she could express. "Why?" she asked again, her voice softer now, filled with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. "Why are you doing this? I don't deserve your help." Jason shook his head. "Everyone deserves a chance to survive, Zora. You can't make it alone out here. And neither can I. We've both got a better shot together." Zora didn't know how to respond. She looked down at the pack in her hands, her mind racing. She had spent so long pushing people away, living in fear, convinced that the universe was a cold, unfeeling place. But Jason was proving her wrong, and with each passing moment, she felt herself change. Maybe there was hope after all. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them both to survive this desert together. "You're right," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we have a better chance together." Jason smiled, and for the first time since they had met, Zora felt a flicker of warmth in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. For now, at least, she wasn't alone. Jason helped her into the speeder, and as they drove away from the spot where she had almost given up, Zora couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. Perhaps in this vast, unforgiving universe, there was still room for kindness. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to believe in it again. The speeder hummed steadily as it cut through the desert sands, its engines a low, comforting sound in the otherwise silent wasteland. Zora sat beside Jason, feeling the wind whip through her hair as they moved farther away from the spot where she had almost given up. Despite the strange, unexpected rescue, a quiet tension still lingered between them. Zora wasn't sure what to think. She had been so used to being alone that she found it difficult to let anyone in. She kept her eyes on the horizon, avoiding Jason's gaze. She wasn't sure how to deal with the warmth that had slowly started to grow inside her ever since he showed up. Jason was driving carefully, his eyes scanning the desert around them. They hadn't spoken much since she accepted his help, but Zora noticed that he kept glancing at her every so often. She could see the concern on his face. She wanted to thank him, to tell him how much his help meant to her. But the words felt too big for her mouth. After all, how could she explain the mix of emotions she was feeling? How could she tell him that she wasn't sure she was grateful or scared of the kindness he was showing her? Jason finally broke the silence. "We're heading to the old outpost," he said, his voice steady. "It's not much, but there's food, shelter, and enough supplies to get us through the night. I think it's our best shot." Zora nodded, her lips pressed together. She was still trying to wrap her head around everything. Jason had risked his own survival to help her, even after she had been rude and dismissive. And now, here she was, sitting next to him in his speeder, trying to convince herself that trusting him wasn't a mistake. The speeder bounced over the rough terrain, making Zora hold on tightly to the side. She glanced at Jason, who seemed completely at ease, despite the harsh conditions. He had a calmness to him that Zora couldn't quite understand. It was the same calmness he had shown when he found her, even when she had been hostile toward him. There was no anger in him, no frustration. It was like he had accepted her resistance, even though it was clear she had no intention of making things easy. As they drove, Zora couldn't help but wonder how he had managed to survive for so long in this desert. She had been struggling for days, her body growing weaker by the hour, but Jason seemed to have adapted. His gear wasn't the best, but it was enough to keep him alive. She wanted to ask him about it, to learn how he had managed to survive, but something held her back. She wasn't ready to open up, not yet. Finally, they reached the outpost. It was an old, abandoned structure, half buried in the sands, but it offered the shelter they desperately needed. Jason parked the speeder next to the entrance, and they both got out. Zora looked up at the outpost, its walls cracked and weathered, but still standing strong against the elements. It was the kind of place she would have avoided if she had been alone. But now it felt like a safe haven, a place to catch her breath and regroup. "Come on," Jason said, motioning for her to follow him. "Let's get inside before the sun goes down. We need to rest." Zora followed him, her steps slow and unsteady. Her body was still exhausted, and her mind was clouded with questions. But for the first time since they had met, she didn't feel as afraid. Jason was here, and he had kept his word. He had helped her when she needed it most, and now he was offering her safety. Maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. Inside the outpost, it was cooler. The walls provided some relief from the scorching desert heat, and there was a faint smell of old machinery and dust. Jason quickly started unpacking the supplies he had brought with him, setting up a small campfire and offering her some of the food he had found earlier. "I don't know how much we have left," Jason said, his voice quiet but steady, "but it's enough to get us through the night. Tomorrow, we'll figure out a plan. We can't stay here forever." Zora nodded, taking the small portion of food he handed her. It was a simple meal, but after days of hunger, it felt like a feast. She ate slowly, savoring the food more than she had expected to. As she ate, her mind wandered. Despite everything, despite the doubts and fears that still gnawed at her, something inside her was starting to change. She had never been this close to another person in her life. She had never trusted anyone to share something as personal as survival. As they sat by the fire, Zora found herself glancing over at Jason. He had taken off his dusty jacket and was busy checking over his gear, making sure everything was still functional. He didn't seem worried, didn't seem bothered by the difficult situation they were in. He simply moved through the motions of preparing for the next day, taking care of what needed to be done without complaint. Zora found herself admiring that calmness. She had never met anyone like him. His kindness, his patience, it was everything she had been taught to fear. Her people always taught her to be wary of others, to expect nothing but betrayal and deception. But here, in this tiny shelter in the middle of a vast desert, Jason was showing her something different. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment press on her. She could feel the hesitation in her chest, the desire to speak, to ask questions that had been building up inside her. Finally, she spoke. "How do you do it?" Zora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you stay so calm?" Jason paused, looking up from his work for a moment. There was something in his eyes, something soft and understanding. "It's not about being calm all the time," he said slowly. "It's about taking things one step at a time. Out here, we don't have the luxury of worrying about what's going to happen next. We have to focus on what we can do now, on what's in front of us. We work with what we have, and we do our best to survive. That's all we can do." Zora looked at him, surprised by his words. She had expected him to give her some cliché answer, something like, "Don't worry," or "Everything will be fine." But his words were real, grounded in the harsh reality they were both facing. She had never heard anyone speak so openly about survival before. A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "I guess I'm not used to this," she admitted. "I've always done things on my own. Never trusted anyone. Never had the chance to." Jason nodded, his expression softening. "I understand. It's not easy to trust. But sometimes we don't have a choice. And sometimes, trusting someone can make all the difference." Zora looked down at the fire, the warmth from the flames soothing her tired body. She could feel the walls she had built around herself slowly crumbling. It was a strange feeling, unfamiliar, but not entirely unwelcome. I think I might be ready to trust you," Zora said quietly, almost to herself. Jason's eyes softened with understanding. "You don't have to do it all at once," he replied. "We'll take things slow, one step at a time. We're in this together." In that moment, Zora realized something important. Trust wasn't about being perfect or never having doubts. It was about taking the first step, even when the road ahead was uncertain. She had taken that first step, and it felt like the beginning of something new, something she hadn't been able to imagine until now. The desert stretched out before them, vast and endless. Zora woke to the feeling of the sun's warmth already creeping through the cracks in the walls of the old outpost. Jason was already up, his face focused as he checked their supplies and gathered what little they had left. The fire from last night had long burned out, and the desert winds had begun to blow sand into the abandoned building. Zora stretched and sat up slowly, the ache in her muscles reminding her that her body was far from recovered. She had spent the night trying to sleep, but her mind wouldn't quiet. She kept thinking about the future, about how much longer they could survive in this desolate place. The sun would be up for hours, and the heat would only make things harder as the day went on. The more she thought about it, the heavier the reality of their situation became. Jason turned to her, his eyes scanning her face as he spoke. "We need to move. The outpost will be too exposed once the heat gets worse. We should head towards the mountains. There's a chance we can find shelter there, maybe even some water." Zora nodded silently. She knew he was right. Staying in the open was too risky, and the mountains, while still a long journey away, offered a glimmer of hope. Still, there was a part of her that wanted to stay where it was safe, where she didn't have to think about the risks of the desert. But safety was a luxury they couldn't afford. Jason packed up their small camp, his movements quick and purposeful. Zora took a deep breath and began gathering what she could, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in her stomach. They didn't have enough food to last much longer. Even the small supply of water Jason had collected was running low. They had both given what little they had to each other, sharing what was left without hesitation. But there was only so much they could do. "Are you ready?" Jason asked, turning to her, his voice calm. He had a way of making even the most difficult situations feel manageable. Zora stood up and wiped the dust off her clothes. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she scanned the horizon, the wide, empty stretch of desert that seemed to go on forever. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had always been alone, always relying on herself, but now she had someone else to think about. Jason was trusting her, and in turn, she was beginning to trust him. It was a strange feeling, like walking on new ground. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew she had no choice. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. Jason gave her a quick nod before turning and leading the way out of the outpost. They began walking, side by side, with the desert sand shifting beneath their feet. The heat was already unbearable, and Zora could feel her body protesting every step. The sun beat down from above, its rays like sharp knives cutting into her skin. She wiped sweat from her brow, trying to ignore the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. Jason didn't seem to be bothered by the heat, but Zora knew better than to compare herself to him. She wasn't used to this. She had never had to walk for miles through an endless desert, carrying only the barest supplies. She had always been able to rely on her strength, on her training, but now it felt like everything was slipping away. She had never felt so weak. The hours seemed to drag on, the landscape around them never changing, always the same: dust, sand, and endless stretches of dry earth. They had passed a few dried-out streams and dead plants along the way, signs of a once lush world that had long since turned into a barren wasteland. But there was no sign of any life, no signs of water or shelter. Zora's legs were starting to feel like they were made of lead. Each step became harder, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. The lack of food and water was beginning to take its toll, and she felt like her energy was fading with every step. She could feel herself slowing down, her pace slipping from Jason's. Jason glanced back and noticed her struggle. Without a word, he slowed down and came to walk beside her. "You need to take it easy," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We're not in a race. We need to conserve our strength." Zora didn't respond. She just nodded, grateful for his concern. But even as he spoke, She felt a surge of frustration. She had never had anyone slow down for her, never had someone look out for her like this. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but she knew he was right. She couldn't keep pushing herself to the limit. Not now. They continued walking, the oppressive heat only growing worse. The sun beat down on them, making the air shimmer with its intensity. Zora tried to focus on her breathing, to push through the exhaustion, but it felt like the world was closing in on her. She could feel the dryness in her throat, the unbearable thirst that gnawed at her from the inside. They had water, but not enough to last the entire journey. And the longer they went without finding shelter or a source of fresh water, the harder it would be to survive. Hours passed, and Zora's head began to spin. She could feel herself growing weaker with every step. Her body was shutting down, and she knew she couldn't keep going much longer. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but there was no rest to be had in the desert. She had to keep moving, or they would both die out here. Jason must have sensed her struggle because he turned to her again. This time, there was no question in his voice. "We need to stop," he said. "There's no point in pushing ourselves until we're both on the edge." Zora opened her mouth to protest, but her body refused to cooperate. Her legs gave out beneath her, and before she could catch herself, she collapsed onto the sand. Her vision blurred, and everything seemed to spin. She could hear Jason's voice, but it sounded far away, like he was underwater. "Zora." Jason's voice was urgent, but she couldn't focus. "Zora, stay with me." She tried to lift her head, but her strength had completely drained. Her eyelids felt heavy, and the desert around her seemed to swallow her up. The heat, the thirst, the hunger, all of it was too much. She had reached her limit. But then she felt something strong lift her, and before she could protest, Jason had pulled her into his arms. "I'm not leaving you here," he said firmly. "I'm going to get us through this. Just hold on." Zora wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she couldn't make it, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was let him carry her, her body limp in his arms. With each step Jason took, Zora clung to the faint hope that they might make it to the mountains, to somewhere that could offer them relief. She didn't know if they would survive this desert, but with Jason by her side, she couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Zora's world was a haze of heat and pain. She could hear the desert wind like a constant whisper and feel the rough sand beneath her. But her body was too weak to respond. She wanted to move, to push herself up, but it felt like the world was pressing down on her chest, keeping her still. Her mind was fuzzy, her thoughts scattered. The only thing she could clearly focus on was the feeling of someone holding her, the strong arms that had lifted her, the calm voice urging her to hold on. She tried to open her eyes, but everything was a blur. Her vision flickered, and the only thing she could make out was Jason's face, close to hers, a mix of worry and determination in his expression. "You're okay." Jason's voice reached her like a lifeline, though she wasn't sure if she truly believed it. "I've got you. Just stay with me." Zora felt something warm against her skin, a damp cloth on her forehead, and heard Jason's soft breathing as he moved around her. His arms tightened around her, and she could feel him trying to lift her up, trying to give her some comfort. But it was so hard, she could barely keep her eyes open. Jason's words were like a beacon in the storm of confusion in her mind. "Stay awake, Zora. I need you to stay awake. We're close. Just a little longer." Zora didn't have the strength to argue. She knew he was trying to keep her alive, to get her through this, but she didn't know if she could hold on. She could hear him muttering softly to himself, maybe praying or just speaking to calm himself down. It was hard to tell. The world felt so distant, like she was floating above it all. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Jason carried her. Every minute felt like an eternity. But eventually, there was a shift in the air. The desert wind, once hot and suffocating, began to cool, and a strange sense of calm settled around them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zora felt the weight lifting from her chest. She was still weak, but she could breathe. She could hear better. She even managed to open her eyes for a moment, catching a glimpse of the mountains in the distance. "We're almost there," Jason said, his voice low but filled with hope. "You're doing great, just a little longer." Zora didn't know how long they had been walking. She didn't know how much strength she had left, but she didn't want to give up. Not now. She had made it this far, and Jason had been by her side every step of the way. He hadn't let her fall. She couldn't let him down now. As they moved closer to the mountains, Zora began to feel a change in the air. The desert, which had seemed so endless and unforgiving, started to give way to something different. There were rocks and small shrubs, signs of life she hadn't expected to see. They were nearing the base of the mountains, and the atmosphere was cooler, the air less dry. But as they reached a small shelter hidden in the rocks, something strange happened. Jason paused for a moment, his body tensing, his face hardening. Zora didn't have the energy to ask what was wrong, but she could feel a change in him. The warmth in his eyes seemed to fade for just a second, replaced by something unreadable. "Jason," Zora managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. Jason glanced down at her, his face softening again. But there was something else behind his eyes now. A conflict, a hint of something Zora couldn't place. "Rest," Jason said gently. "We're safe now. I'll get you some water, and then we'll talk." Zora nodded, exhausted. She had no energy to question him further. But as he went to the small water stash inside the shelter, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had seen the shift in him, the momentary change in his demeanor. It made her wonder, who was this man really? Jason returned a few moments later with a small flask of water. He helped her sit up and gently pressed it to her lips, allowing her to sip slowly. The cool water felt like a gift from the heavens, but even as she drank, Zora couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen in Jason's eyes. "Thank you," Zora murmured after drinking. "But there's something I need to know." Jason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set the flask aside and sat down beside her. His gaze was steady, but there was something in the way he looked at her now, like he was about to share something important. "You're wondering why I'm helping you, aren't you?" Jason asked, his voice soft but serious. Zora's heart skipped a beat. "Yes," she admitted. You've been kind to me. But there's something about you, something I don't understand." Jason sighed deeply, rubbing his hands over his face as if he was weighing something heavy. He glanced out over the landscape for a long moment, as if searching for the right words. Zora waited, her eyes locked on his face, eager for answers. "Zora, the truth is," Jason started, then hesitated. "The truth is that I'm not just some random traveler. I'm not from here. I've been sent to find you." Zora's heart raced. She tried to sit up straighter, but dizziness washed over her. "What do you mean? Sent by who?" Jason took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm not just a survivor in this desert. I'm part of a group that knows about your people, about your home. We've been trying to reach you, trying to get to you before it was too late." Zora's mind was spinning. She couldn't understand. "You're part of a group. What do you know about me? About where I'm from?" Jason looked at her, his expression serious but not unkind. "I know a lot more than you think, Zora, and you're in danger. Your world, it's not what you think it is. The desert, the way it's consuming everything, it's no accident. There's a force at work here, something far bigger than either of us, and I've been sent to help you survive it." Zora felt her pulse quicken, fear and confusion surging in her chest. "What are you talking about? What force? What's going on?" Jason ran a hand through his hair and let out a shaky breath. "It's hard to explain. But you're not just any survivor, Zora. You're part of something important, something that's been hidden. And the people who have been watching you, they're dangerous." Zora stared at him, her mind reeling. This was too much. She had always been alone, had always believed that her struggles were her own. Now Jason was saying that everything she had known, everything she had fought for, was part of something much bigger. She wasn't just surviving the desert. She was caught in a much larger battle. Jason's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I'm sorry you had to find out like this, but you deserve to know the truth. You're not alone, Zora. And you never were." Zora sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything Jason had just told her. The truth about her past, her people, and the forces that had been quietly watching her. None of it made sense. She felt like her whole world had been turned upside down. And yet, she knew that somehow everything Jason said was true. The pieces of her life, her memories, her struggles, all seemed to come together in a way she couldn't yet fully understand. Jason had explained that the desert wasn't just an unforgiving wasteland. It was a result of something much darker, something beyond her comprehension. And somehow, Zora herself was connected to it. But how? And why her? Her mind swirled with questions, and the weight of her situation pressed down on her chest. How could she possibly accept this new reality? The life she had lived until now, her fight for survival, her loneliness, had been all she knew. She had always relied on her instincts, her strength, but now there was so much more at stake. There were forces at work, and she was at the center of them. Jason seemed to sense her confusion and hesitation. He sat next to her, his face soft but serious. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said gently, "but I need you to trust me. I've been sent to help you find the answers you need." Zora blinked, trying to gather her thoughts. "But why me? Why are they watching me?" Jason looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and urgency. "You're not just anyone, Zora. You've been chosen for something important, something bigger than you can imagine. And I can't tell you everything yet, but I will. You just need to trust that there's a reason for all of this. The desert, the people who are after you, they're all connected. And you're the key to stopping it." Zora felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had always thought of herself as just a survivor, someone who fought to stay alive, no matter the odds. But now, Jason was telling her she had a role to play in something far greater. It was hard to accept, but she couldn't ignore the truth in his eyes. He wasn't lying. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any signs of deceit. But there was nothing there, just a deep, unshakable sense of responsibility. Jason believed in her, and for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she believed in him too. "Okay," she said slowly, her voice shaky but determined. "I trust you. But I need to know what comes next. What are we going to do?" Jason's expression softened with relief. "First, we rest. You've been through a lot. I can see how exhausted you are. The mountains are safe for now, but the journey is far from over. We need to rebuild our strength, and once we do, we'll start finding the answers." Zora nodded, feeling a small sense of comfort in his words. She had been pushing herself for so long, always on the move, always fighting for survival. The idea of resting, of taking a moment to breathe, felt like a luxury she hadn't had in years. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to relax, just a little. They spent the next few days in the shelter Jason had found, a small hidden cave at the base of the mountains. The rocks provided a shield from the harsh desert winds, and the cool air was a relief after the unrelenting heat. Jason managed to find more water and some dried food, and though it wasn't much, it was enough to keep them going. Zora spent her days resting, regaining her strength. She ate what little food they had, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel something other than the constant pressure of survival. She was safe, at least for now. It was a strange feeling, one she hadn't experienced in years. But even as she rested, her mind was always active, always questioning. Jason had told her she was the key to stopping whatever force was behind the desert's destruction. But how could she possibly be that important? What was it about her that made her the one they were all after? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the mountains. Jason sat down beside her. "Zora," he began, his voice quiet but serious, "I think it's time for you to know more. The time for questions is coming to an end. We need to prepare for what's ahead." Zora turned to face him, her heart racing. "I'm ready," she said, though part of her wasn't sure if she was. She had to be, though. Jason had told her she was important. She couldn't turn back now. Jason nodded. "I'm going to explain everything, but you have to understand. This is dangerous. You're not just facing the desert. You're facing something that has been hidden for a long time. Something that could destroy everything." Zora's breath caught in her throat. "What are we talking about, Jason?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, as if he were sharing a secret. "There are ancient forces at play here, Zora. Forces that have been manipulating the world for centuries. The desert is only the beginning. It's a result of something much bigger, a force that has been working in the shadows, trying to take control." Zora felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known there was something wrong with the world, something off about the desert and the way it had spread. But to hear Jason say it out loud made everything feel more real, more dangerous. "The people who have been watching you," Jason continued, "they're part of this force. They want to use you for their own purposes. But we can stop them. We can change the course of this world. We have to, or everything will be lost." Zora's mind was spinning, but one thing was clear. She couldn't turn away from this now. She had a purpose, a mission. The desert had taken so much from her already, but now she had a chance to fight back, to stop the destruction. She took a deep breath and looked at Jason. "So, what do we do next?" Jason smiled slightly, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "We fight. But before that, we prepare. We find the answers. We gather the tools we need to survive, and we face whatever comes next. Together." Zora nodded. For the first time, in a long time, she felt like she had something to fight for. She had never known a life beyond survival, but now she had a purpose. Jason had given her a new beginning, a chance to change the course of everything. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a warrior. And this battle was just beginning. The next day, Jason began to teach her about the tools they would need to survive the coming storm. They gathered resources, studied maps, and planned their next move. Every step brought them closer to the answers Zora desperately needed. But as they worked together, Zora realized something. She wasn't just learning how to fight the world around her. She was learning how to trust again. And that perhaps was the most important lesson of all. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Zora felt ready. She was no longer alone, and with Jason by her side, they would face whatever came next, together.